Here's an idea. Let's not get crazy.
It's good to see you, Karen.
Good to see you too.
It's been a while since we've had a podcast, and many things have happened since we had our last podcast, I believe.
That is true.
Most important thing is that we're publishing our book August 10th, and we have a commitment from former Texas Governor Rick Perry to write the foreword. And so we'll be sending, for those who don't know about our book, you can go to our book website, which is sensiblepsychedelicsbook.com, and you can read about the book. We also have a library there, which has a lot of materials, a lot of links to other organizations and publications dealing with this psychedelic renaissance. And we also have built 3 guides for beginners in this space that want to understand what they would need to do if they were to go on a journey, how they would speak to their doctor. And you can download those. Those are free on the website as well. But our launch week is going to be August 10th. We're not exactly sure what day it is going to launch, and that's our paperback edition on Amazon. So we look forward to getting any feedback from people and reviews that have an interest in picking up that book. And it will also be on Kindle that week as well. And then we'll shortly thereafter have the Audible version up and running. So I thought, Karen, I've been reading this book, Inside the Box, with David Epstein. And I believe the subtitle is How Limitations Can Lead to Growth and Creativity. And I'm finding it fascinating because it essentially goes against the mantra, the tagline, the phrase that we've always heard, which is think outside the box. If you think outside the box, you can be more creative, you can be more productive. And his argument is that it's actually limitations in our life which help us to be creative, help us to be innovative, and that we experience almost all of our growth through some form of a limitation or a challenge that we've had in our life. And so I thought there were so many analogs to the psychedelic experience that we could have a discussion about that. And I know you've got a lot of personal experience as well as professional experience in this particular area. So with that, I thought we could just kind of jump in and talk about this at a macro level, and then mention some very specific instances in which this type of limitation or structure can bring about growth.
Great. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'm thinking of therapeutically, because that's my role here, is to represent the therapy space. And the therapy space is loss, grief, change. Any disruption in our expectation is what creates growth. We don't necessarily grow through just inspiration and divine bliss, but it's through the challenges and the things that hurt us that we have greater capacity. And I think there's such a physical analog as, our bones are fighting against gravity. And creativity, if you're given limitations, then you become more, like in his book he's talking about, it sounds like you become more able to access a creative part of yourself because you have to work around something that's resisting you. And the first image I got when you said think outside of the box is that the important piece there is the relationship to the box is the thing that is creating the creativity or launches the creativity. Otherwise, there's like free form nothingness. And I can see why you would think that is similar to what a useful psychedelic experience is. So I'm curious what your thoughts were about that. Like, how does that translate to a useful, growth-oriented psychedelic experience?
Yeah. So it's what I found interesting about the book. I'm also watching a documentary series with my wife about Burning Man and the history of Burning Man and how it was not only created, but how it grew into what it is today, which is a truly global phenomenon.
And not something known for its boundaries necessarily.
No, exactly. And so we can come back to that in a minute because I'm just finding the documentary fascinating. But as I was watching the documentary, we're on, I believe, episode 3 or 4 now, it struck me that the psychedelic experience is very similar to Burning Man in many ways. And in fact, I wanted to, before I answer your question about how the psychedelic experience might relate to David Epstein's book, I want to play a video that we can include if our tech team is working properly and effectively, we can include in this podcast. But I'm going to play this now, and we will include it in the podcast. You can see it. But this has become kind of a famous meme for Burning Man, where a woman was was interviewed, and I'm just going to go ahead and run this. Okay, so it's a woman. For those who are just listening to this podcast, it's a woman. She's dressed up in typical Burning Man garb for during the evening, and some reporters asking her, "What does Burning Man mean to you?" And she says, "Death, destruction, mayhem, and lots of fun." And she smiles and giggles. It's kind of a funny joke, but it's what's interesting is that in a psychedelic journey, you can have death, you can have destruction of narratives that you have thought were so true in your own life, narratives about who you are, how you relate to other people, how you relate to the world. You can have a deconstruction, if I guess in the words of the critical theorists, you can deconstruct that. The medicines do a really good job at that. And you can have mayhem because there can be complete chaos. Like with any type of a dream state, there can be a lot of disorganization and chaos, and you can have lots and lots of fun in a journey as well. So it's interesting that in a psychedelic journey, you can have all of those things, just like you could experience at Burning Man. But I've known people who have gone to Burning Man and have had horrible experiences. And I've also known people who've gone to Burning Man and had incredible experiences. And I think it depends on not just the frame of mind that you take into the journey or at Burning Man, but also most of the people that I know that have had really bad experiences, they felt very unsafe. So they were, for instance, it was at night. It's a full city now, right? You can get lost in it. And they had been taking drugs and they got lost. They got separated from their friends. You could call that the structure, right? They moved outside the box. They moved beyond the pale and found it a very scary and terrifying experience. And and I think you can have that similarly in psychedelics in various ways by not having a proper set in your mindset, by not preparing, and by not having a proper setting, by not being in a safe setting, by not being with facilitators that you can trust with your life and with your psyche, and with your not just your physical being, but with your mental being as well. And so it's interesting. To me, the Burning Man, and maybe we'll just jump into it now. To me, the Burning Man experience is an interesting one. And this documentary is showing how difficult it is to walk that fine line between having enough structure at Burning Man to where people are safe. They don't get run over in the middle of the night in their tent by some car that's driving through the desert. And also allow for the spontaneity that can come from people essentially cosplaying. I mean, because it's not real what they're doing. But they are cosplaying. And I think a lot of really interesting, fascinating things can come out of that cosplaying, and both us as social animals, as well as very creative animals, getting together with other people and cosplaying, essentially, which is what they do at Burning Man. But in the documentary, it talks about the tension that has arisen as the number of people that have come to Burning Man has just ballooned. I believe it was 80,000 last year.
Oh, wow.
And the need for order and structure as it's gotten larger. When it was just 100 people on a beach, I believe it was right south of San Francisco, there was no need for any structure at all. They just, they hoisted up the wooden man and they burned him. There was no organization at all. But now as it's gotten larger, you need that type of organization. And I would say the same is true about the psychedelic renaissance, that as it gets larger and starts to scale, there's a need to have, it can be self-organization, but there needs to be an organization, a type of organization or architecture in place in order to allow people the kind of freedom that they want to have in a psychedelic journey, in the same way that people that go to Burning Man want to have that type of freedom as well, so that they can explore and see what comes of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many interesting things in Burning Man and what you just said about the tension. I mean, the reason Burning Man exists, let's say fundamentally, is to resist the norm culture. And so that's why it's so satisfying, right? And that's why it's so explosive, is they're having the relationship to their normal lives or capitalist culture or whatever the criticisms are of a traditional culture. And so it's the relationship of rejecting it that becomes the fantasy, and which isn't bad. I just think it can't be confused with reality. And that, I mean, to overlay a therapeutic structure onto the psychedelic experience. For me, it seems like it is extremely important, like you said, to have the safe people. This is how set and setting works, and setting intentions is that you are allowed enough freedom of losing your mind, but within this context and focused goal. Even if that's not what ends up happening, you have a fundamental thing you can rest in, that you are doing this for a purpose or for healing. And I know you don't necessarily agree with that. Like you think it can be recreational too. And my bias is that it really is sort of precious in that way to use for healing. So I feel comfortable in the constraint, and I think it probably allows for greater growth.
Yeah. Going back to this woman who was interviewed,
Mhm.
I had to giggle when I saw it the first time, because when she says death, destruction, mayhem, and lots of fun, obviously those in the real world, those don't go together.
Seemingly
in the real
polar
world.
opposites.
Right. They're polar opposites. And I think that in the real world, ironically, if you're in a situation where you have death, destruction, and mayhem, it's generally the females that end up experiencing the brunt of that, because they're the more vulnerable of the two sexes. And if you're thinking of raw physical anarchy, warring tribes, they're definitely the most vulnerable
I see.
of the sexes. They're the more vulnerable than the other. And here's a woman saying how great death, destruction, and mayhem. And it made me think of Michael Schellenberger's comment that he made on Dad Saves America, that he said, we're in a weird situation where historically institutions and government have been boring and stable and allowed culture and artists to be transgressive and to be innovative and explore and kind of, go beyond the pale and test the edges. And that's how we grow over time. We test the edges, whatever works, we adopt, and what doesn't work, we reject as a society. And that's how we, over time grow and improve. And what I find and then, because in that same interview, he said, when institutions become transgressive, it leaves the art, it kills art, it kills creativity. And he talked about it in the context of, if you think of how little creativity comes out of Hollywood today, and how little creativity comes out of what is ostensibly the transgressive culture, it's very orthodox. It's very bland. And I see it in the psychedelic culture as well, that the culture, the institution of the psychedelic renaissance, if you will, if there is such a thing as an institution, it should be relatively stable and boring, so that people within that psychedelic renaissance can experiment and can explore. But because there's been so much, I'll just use MAPS as an example, but I think most of the institutions within the psychedelic renaissance are similar, because they have become so permissive, kind of a free-for-all, allowing everything to transpire without any judgment of its efficacy or of its moral weight. A strange kind of a orthodoxy has set into the movement. So I think it's Michael Schellenberger's concern plays out even in this microcosm that we call the psychedelic community, or the the psychedelic renaissance.
Well, we're the transgressives now by saying, no, I believe in God. I believe in faith, whatever that is. I believe in morals. I believe in heteronormalcy. That doesn't mean that we're phobic or against these things, but we are now perceived as these outliers and transgressors, when 15 years ago we were in the bell curve, not the outlier. And it reminds me of, because I went to a transgressive university. I went to Naropa University. It was an institute when I went, because it was so small, and it was in the 90s, and it was based on Buddhism. And so every art piece was very similar. I mean, there was some great art, I have to say. I was in the dance community. Improvisation was so I majored in improvisational dance, if you can believe that there is such a major. I did that. And the thing that makes improvisation powerful and interesting and not chaotic is structure. And you're really relying on like an underlying beat. Let's say there's still a beat. Even if you're disrupting the beat, you can feel it, and the audience can feel it, that you are referencing something else. And the reason it's interesting is because you're referencing something else and rejecting it or having a relationship to it. So I see your analogy here with psychedelics, is that if it's all permissive, all encompassing, where It reminds me of the idea you had, the value of the idea of putting it in the church. And let's say psychedelic wisdom is coming through an organized religion or the church. There's something structured and safe and reliable, and you've got your spirituality, your morality, your clinical training, everything in that culture. Then you can transgress within yourself and find deeper meaning and do those things. You don't have to reject the institution. I know that's a bunch of ideas put together, but I think this is a really interesting way to look at the value of inviting conservatives into the psychedelic open space.
Yeah, and I think if we get more normies into the space, it's going to be extremely healthy, not only for the movement. I think it's going to be quite healthy for those in the movement today who will trend toward more of that freedom side of the ledger and less order side. I think injecting a little bit more, I don't want to call it adult supervision because that sounds very judgy, but I'm going to call it adult supervision. Bringing more adults that have day jobs, that have children, that are struggling with what we'd call kind of traditional challenges in life and raising kids and taking care of our, aging parents, and not as immersed in the culture, in the psychedelic culture. I think it could be quite healthy to have a very large group of people that become psychonauts, but don't identify with that psychedelic culture, because the majority of the people that I know are so identified with the psychedelic culture, it becomes hard to see outside that it becomes so immersive. It's hard to see outside that culture and see how other people are experiencing the world. I've even fallen into that to some extent, not with psychedelics, but living here in Park City. We call it the bubble because it's not anything like most of the country or most of the world for that matter. And I keep having to remind myself, and we remind the kids and they remind us, like, this isn't real. This isn't real. People flying in on private jets at Heber Airport in order to come skiing and, paying for $100 meals. That's just not how most people live.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
or how you grew up even. So you've got,
exactly.
You're grounded in this other reality, which I think really helps.
Yeah.
I'm speaking from Kirkland, Washington right now. So I'm in a similar bubble east of Seattle.
Yeah, there were a few other things that you had just mentioned that I wanted to riff off, and I can't. Oh, I was trying to think of some examples of that issue of control versus freedom, order versus freedom. And when people find out that I paraglide, they just think it's the most amazing thing. And I guess once you get used to something, you think it's just normal. I've been doing it now for about 20 years, but they always talk about it in terms of like, wow, it must be so incredible flying like a bird. You're so free up there. And I started thinking about this yesterday in the context of paragliding has severe limitations placed on it. I learn a lot by paragliding. I find it thoroughly enjoyable and sometimes terrifying as well. But there are severe constraints within this free flying environment. You have gravity, which is, we always talk about, we're like Buzz Lightyear. We're falling with style. We're always falling. You're always being pulled down to the earth. Sometimes the thermals will be pushing you up more than the gravity's pulling you down, in which case you rise, and then you can travel around a valley and stay up for relatively long periods of time. But you have gravity, you have thermals, you have wind, you're constantly looking for a landing zone because we're not under power. So we're going to land where nature tells us we're going to land.
You're always going to come down.
We're always going to come down. We're ultimately always going to come down. And so you have all these constraints of essentially physics that you're dealing with when you're paragliding. But I think that's what makes it so attractive. And whether we're innovating or creating, we're not really doing that when we're paragliding. I think it's mostly just enjoying the thrill of the ride and enjoying nature and flying with hawks and eagles.
Well, you're transcending your natural limitations, which is what creativity is as well, is what healing is as well. I mean, it's really the ultimate transcendence when we push past these limitations.
I hadn't thought about
David
it
Epstein talks about Shakespeare, that you think about the transcendence of Shakespeare. Well, it is so iambic pentameter, and it is so rhyming. And one of the reasons it's so incredible is that he worked within these very serious constraints of language in order to create that transcendent experience. So paragliding seems similar to Shakespeare in that way.
No, that's I had never thought of it in that way. I'll have to tell my literary cousin that's really into Shakespeare that I'm just essentially doing Shakespeare in the air.
Absolutely.
It's interesting. I have a cousin who she lives without constraints, has absolutely zero constraints in her life. And, or at least those that she has, maybe society or her checkbook has placed some constraints on her, but she lives with this notion that she's a free spirit, and she's now in her mid to late 30s. She still couch surfs. She doesn't have a place of her own. She doesn't really have a job. She can't seem to keep jobs. She gets let go a lot from jobs. And I think she's really a very unhappy person, but she doesn't realize it's because of this lack of any constraint that she has in her life. She's very much into self-expression, which to us in the family just appears very self-indulgent. But I think it's because she has no responsibility to anyone. And she has, other than self-expression, she has no real purpose in her life. And I think that lack of constraint has really hurt her over time, and has made her actually a very unhappy person.
That's the thing. I mean, we talk about this in therapy as a healthy amount of stress. You need healthy stress in your life. Otherwise, you can indulge luxury beliefs. And like you were pointing out earlier in our conversation, if therapy is sycophantic and affirming utterly of you without producing any real feedback or container for your experience, questioning you, then you just get deeper into your delusion, which ultimately means more unhappy and maybe more isolated and not able to function, and all these things that human beings really thrive when they have this healthy amount of stress. If it goes outside that window and there's too much stress, then you can collapse and things can happen, and addiction and patterns. And if there's too little stress, you're outside that window. So it's that sweet spot of stress that is transcendent. And I think maybe psychedelics sort of, not artificially, but from an external source, place our systems in that kind of stress where our perceptions are altered, and we suddenly see time differently, feel time differently, have experiences we wouldn't consciously do otherwise. Then we need more constraint on the outside. Like, this is my bias again, therapy, set and setting, someone who knows us to help guide us, and then integrate it through.
When you said that, it made me think of the journeys that I remember the most are journeys that involved integration after, because in almost all of my journeys, I'll come out feeling almost borderline mania. I'll have just a flood of insights, ideas, and drives my wife crazy. And if I don't put those on paper, if I don't start journaling the next day, if I don't start talking to her about those experiences with the objective of trying to find those kernels of truth, those insights in all the noise that I experienced, and then incorporate them into my life, like maybe just a very specific action item. I'm going to do this every day for the next 7 days that I hadn't done before. When I don't do that, I find that I live in this world of unlimited opportunity for about a week. It's almost a frenetic type of insight or insights that come to me. And then they, over time, drift away. They become less powerful, less impactful. But those insights that I put into a structure stay with me.
Yeah. After the ecstasy, the laundry. That's a Zen saying. And you have these samadhi, these enlightenment experiences through the structure of sitting meditation for hours and hours and months and days and years. Then you have a flash of enlightenment, and you can feel you have the answers to the universe, but then the next day you have to do the laundry. And both of those things are true. How do you integrate your enlightenment into the laundry?
Yes, indeed. The laundry's always there. It's always there.
Yeah. We're always going to hit the ground, and death. We're all headed towards the same endpoint, which is the ultimate constraint.
Yes.
So psychedelics help us transcend that, and then structure within psychedelics helps us transcend even our own internal machinations. So
as a nephew of mine says, life is like a horror movie. We're all in the basement and nobody's getting out alive.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
But well, this great. This has been a good conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close this out?
No, I just think it's good to remember that there are people that are in the psychedelic world who might not agree with what we're saying, and and to put our conversation into context, someone might interject like, well, indigenous wisdom, or it's white Western values of progress, that us trying to categorize and see things within constraint might be seen as a threat to the dismantling ideology. And so just the premise of our book and of everything that we're doing is that our voices should be allowed in that space. Saying constraint is valuable should be allowed in that space.
Yeah. And I would add on the indigenous, I'm guessing, unless every anthropologist that's ever written a book on this is wrong, is that most Indian populations lived under serious constraints. And in fact, the more we go back in our history as humans, the more constrained we were. It wasn't too long ago, 200,000 years ago, where we were hunter-gatherers and hiding in caves because we didn't want the big cats to be eating us. We were prey, right? It's only recently. In fact, I read a recent fascinating story. I think I've got the book up here on my shelf. I highly recommend it. It's on, it's the last, hopefully they didn't show that that I've got shorts on because it's nice and hot here, but it's The Last Comanche Chief. And it's about the life and times of Quanah Parker. And when you read the stories of these indigenous populations, you understand how brutal life was and how subsistence living was, in every sense of the word. These were tribes which were just on the edge of starvation most of the time. And I think that was the way most humans lived up until recently. So this notion that somehow living under constraints and setting priorities is a Western phenomenon. I think it's more of a human one. I did want to ask you something, which it's not a total non sequitur, but it is related to what we're talking about. But in this documentary, The Man Will Burn, they interview the leaders that are males, and they almost exclusively are not worried about safety. They're full on. This is anarchy. This is this is a free for all. And the women that have gotten involved, because initially the founders were just males, but women got involved fairly early on. They're the ones that are, when they're interviewed, they're very concerned about safety, and they're very concerned about making sure that the environment there, I think it's called Black Rock City, is a safe place during Burning Man. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on, in the context of limitations and institutions, whether the role that females play in setting those limitations versus, males throughout history, and as well as maybe in our modern times.
A lot of thoughts on that. But the first thing that comes to mind is it's interesting to see safety as limitation. I would see safety as a container for adventure. And so maybe that's a male-female perspective. Safety implies that there's a limitation on someone's, let's say, authentic impulse. So maybe that's how it's safety. Yeah, it really is interesting because safety, I don't know much about Burning Man. I'm thinking about hippies, but I know that's a different culture. I'm thinking about the safety might mean to a 60s folk music worshiper, authentic expression. And, everyone else has permission to have their authentic expression. And so therefore that's good. And yet authentic expression isn't necessarily how we need to modulate ourselves in society. And so that's not safe. But then there's also, to contradict myself, suicidal empathy, which is over empathizing and creating this environment where no one can have any hurt feelings because people are so fragile and there's no resilience. So I would say ultimately we always need those two perspectives. Maybe you could say the masculine and the feminine, but the authentic expression, let's go for it. Let's just do the thing we all want to do. And then some modulation of that so that everyone can be included, or a lot of people can be included. It's a marriage.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that has come out in the interviews of the people, that when you essentially say we're going to build a city and we're not going to have any governing structure or any government in this city. Yeah. There's no one's going to be in charge. It's interesting how the females, by and large, that are organizing that event are concerned about safety, and the males are concerned more about having too much structure. So it's kind of interesting that that's come out.
Yeah.
Maybe that argues that civilization is good because it protects the more vulnerable among us. And when you don't have it, you're going to get potentially, and I think that's what happened in the 1996 Burning Man. There were 2 deaths, and it was just mayhem. It was really out of control. And that's when they started. I think they negotiated an arrangement with the BLM to have much more structure in place and to have a lot of these. What one of the founders said. Well, I guess we're now the government of. It was one of the organizers of Burning Man said, I guess we're the government now.
Well, it's the truth of human nature and impulse, and that we really do need the marriage of the masculine and the feminine and those principles, however they play out. But when you have luxury beliefs that are untethered from the reality of human impulses, you have a lot of progressively liberal ideas, if we're looking at that from a political lens.
Yeah.
But if you are someone who's grounded in reality and sees limitations and experiences them every day with the weather or monetary limitations, you're more aware of that side of things. It's not as easy to go off into luxury beliefs.
Well, I think this was an interesting conversation, at least.
Thank you for bringing it up.
You taught me a few things, that's for sure. So just a reminder, sensiblepsychedelicsbook.com. You can go on that website. It's advertising the countdown to the launch, the week of August 10th. The paperback, you can get it on Amazon, and you can also get the Kindle version. That first week, it will be on sale for 99 cents, I believe. So, So get the Kindle while you can, but obviously buy the paperback because we would like to be able to recoup our costs from our editor if possible. So, with that, I guess we'll close it out and hopefully make this a more common occurrence than we have in the last month or so.
Have fun and be sensible.